Happy Friday and welcome back to Drinking by My Shelf. My name is Emma and today I'm going to take a stroll down memory lane. I was looking through my bookshelves the other day and thinking about when I read each of my favourite books for the first time, how old I was and where I was in my life, and then just thinking how lovely and exciting it is that when you first open a book for the first time, you first turn over that front page, you have no idea that that book might be about to change your life. And I thought that was a really sweet idea, so I wanted to make a video about it. And I'm incredibly lucky because I've always kept a record of my books. Basically since around 1997, when I was 6 years old, I've kept some kind of diary of the books that I read. So it was really easy for me to go back and see when I first read all these different books. So what I've decided to do today is go through and pick one book from each year of my life so far that I read for the first time that year and that still stayed with me or changed my life in some way. But if you'd like to have a go at doing this, and I'd love to see some other people do it, I know that not everyone will have such a strong record of everything that they've read. So basically you can just use this tag, we'll call it the memory lane book tag, to think of some of your favourite books and remember where you were when you first read them and how old you were and what that first experience was like. So let's get started on my own memory lane. When I was 6 years old, I read for the first time Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. I remember we were on a holiday in the south of France and we'd gone there with another family, and that family had this book, so they were being read it as their bedtime story. So me and my sister went in and listened, and I remember running around this villa in France trying to make things fly, saying Wingardium Leviosa to everything. We thought it was so exciting. And then we got back to England and found that all of our friends at school had also been reading it, and it was this huge thing that we hadn't known was happening. Harry Potter, of course, is a pretty important book in most people of my generation's lives. Funnily enough, that wasn't actually where my Harry Potter love started. While I really enjoyed that first book and the first few, I then just stopped reading the series. Shock, I know. So we will return to Harry Potter when it came back into my life later. When I was 7 years old is the first time that I remember getting a book hangover, and that's because I read Northern Lights. And I still remember that sad feeling of finishing the book. I was at my aunt and uncle's house. I know exactly where I was sitting in the room, to the extent that when I went back to visit them years later, I walked in and was like, "You used to have a chair there, didn't you?" And they were like, "Yes, how do you remember that?" And I was like, "Because I finished Northern Lights sitting in that chair." And I remember being devastated that there was no more book. I'd finished the last page and there was nothing else to read, and I was so sad about it. I've actually tried rereading Northern Lights more recently and couldn't get into it at all, so maybe it was just perfect for me at that time in my life and I'm not going to love it again, which is a shame. When I was 8 years old was the first and only time that I read The Hobbit. And I remember this because it was very embarrassing. We had to have the whole class in music doing orchestra, and I couldn't really play any musical instruments. I was never very musically talented, so I was on the xylophone or something that didn't have much of a big part. So while we were doing rehearsals, the teacher said that I could sit and read until my part came around, and I got so engrossed in The Hobbit that I totally forgot. A little bit embarrassing when I realised everyone was waiting for me to ding my xylophone. I don't know what the word is, but that's just how engrossing The Hobbit was. Now, here's a big one. When I was 9 years old was the first time that I read Ella Enchanted. And as you know if you've watched my videos before, because I mention it all the time, this is one of my all-time favourite books. I love it so much. It's this fantastically feminist fairy tale. I wrote my whole dissertation at Oxford about it. But when I first read it when I was 9 years old, I had no idea what a profound impact it would have on my life. I loved it straight away, but I didn't know it was feminist. I didn't think I even knew what feminism was when I was 9. I just remember totally falling in love with the world and really fancying Prince Char. This book still makes me cry with happiness every time. Even while I was writing my dissertation, whenever I would have to just flick through it to get a quote, I would get towards the end and tears would just spring to my eyes in the middle of the library. I love it so much. When I was 10 years old, it was my first memory of required reading. So it was the summer before I was due to start at my boarding school, and they sent out to all of the students a book called King of Shadows, which is a time travel book about a boy who trades places with Shakespeare, I think. I loved it so much, and most of the excitement was because I was so looking forward to going to my boarding school, and this was the first kind of link that I had. It also probably started my love of time travel books. When I was 11, it was the first time that I read The Wanderer, and that was significant because that's where I learned the phonetic alphabet. I can't remember the story other than that the main girl lived on a boat and she had to learn to say her name in the phonetic alphabet. Her name was Sophie, so people would call her Sierra Oscar for short. Not really shorter than Sophie, but I thought that was cute. And it was another of our required reading books for school, so we all kind of learnt to call each other our phonetic alphabet names. Mine was Echo Mike. When I was 12 was the first time I read Rebecca, and I remember this because I hated it. It was another required book for school, and we all thought that it was so boring. We all made such a fuss about having to read it. But the reason I remember this is because I've never read it since, but every time I hear anything about it, I'm like, That sounds bloody amazing. This book sounds so creepy and enticing, and I don't remember getting into any of that when I was 12. I think I was too young for it. When I was 13, it was the first time I read The Time Traveller's Wife, and this is now one of my favourite books. It's probably one of the books that I've reread the most often, but I actually haven't read it for a few years, so I think it's due another reread. And I remember my mum trying to read it and saying that she couldn't really get into it. And she gave it to me to read, and I remember she gave it with a warning that it had a lot of sex in it and a lot of swearing in it, because I was only 13, but I just absolutely loved it. I was so obsessed with it, and I really wanted to become a film producer so that I could make the film version. I was so disappointed when that happened without me. And I now just really want to sit down and read this book, because I can't believe I haven't read it in so long. I used to reread it about once a year. There's just something so magical about it. Oh, love this book. When I was 14, I got really into the Princess Diaries series. It was a few years after I'd seen the movie that I got really into the books, but I liked the books so much better. I mean, the movie's great too, but the books is where I completely fell in love with Michael. But I'm actually not sure if I got to the end of the series. I feel like there might be books out there that I haven't yet read, which is exciting because I will read them. When I was 15, it was the first time I read a Jodi Picoult book. The first one I read was The Pact, and then I just went from there and I read every Jodi Picoult book I could possibly lay my hands on. I decided that I wanted to be a lawyer, which, lol, that's hilarious because I obviously don't want to be a lawyer now. I don't know if I even read anything else that year that wasn't by Jodi Picoult. I was just completely obsessed. And like with anything else that you get obsessed with and then overdo, I now have no desire to read any Jodi Picoult ever again. I'm sure they're great, but I just really ruined it for myself that year. Now, when I was sweet 16, it was the first time that I read Pride and Prejudice. It wasn't my first Jane Austen. I used to be really weirdly obsessed with Sense and Sensibility when I was a lot younger, but I was totally misreading it back then as well, because I thought that Marianne was like the gold standard of how people should act and everyone else was really lame. So Pride and Prejudice was the first time that I really read a Jane Austen book and understood it, and God, did I find it so funny. My dad has always loved Jane Austen, so it was quite fun having this to bond with him. We could quote lines at each other, and that really kick-started the love for Jane Austen that I still have today. It was after reading Pride and Prejudice that I decided to just go on a rampage. I read Emma that year as well. I got back into Sense and Sensibility and understood it a bit better. That was really the start of it all. When I was 17, I first read another book that would go on to become one of my all-time favourites, and that is Vile Bodies by Evelyn Waugh. I actually watched the movie first, Bright Young Things, which is a great movie. It's a much cheerier adaptation than the book is, but I absolutely loved it. Me and my friends all watched it, and we all wanted to talk like them and their really over-the-top accents, and such a fun film. So then when that year at school our teacher asked if any of us wanted to suggest a book for coursework, me and my friend who were obsessed with Bright Young Things suggested that we read Vile Bodies. And it was kind of hilarious because everyone else in the class absolutely hated it. I don't know why, I guess because it's kind of weird, but the two of us adored it, and to this day I love it so much because it's really funny and it is satirical, it is supposed to be funny, but there's also so much sadness under the surface that he never really talks about, which makes it even sadder. So I will always love this book. I own about 5 copies of it. This is my favourite, this one that I bought last year. So beautiful. When I was 18, that was the first time that I read the Twilight series. And I read the whole thing, because I'm pretty certain they were all out by then. I had resisted for a while. Some of my friends had been reading them in sixth form, and I was like, I don't want to read your stupid vampire stories. And then I remember literally being in the kitchen at our boarding house, and my friends like held me down and put it in front of my face and made me read it. And I kind of pretended to keep resisting, but actually was like, oh my god, I love this. And then, yeah, I was obsessed. I read all 4 of them. I went to the midnight showings of the movies. I had a t-shirt that said Team Jacob on the back and The Cullens Don't Come Here on the front. I don't regret it, but I kind of regret it. When I was 19, it was the first time that I read One Day. I'm not going to tell the story again because I've told the story so many times on this channel, but this was the one that I read all in one day on a hill in Italy, and it's just one of my favourite reading experiences of all time, so that happened when I was 19. When I was 20 was the first time that I read The Penelopiad by Margaret Atwood. This was on our reading list at university, and it was probably the first feminist work that I read knowing that it was a feminist work. It's funny looking back now that feminism is such a big part of my life that it was actually quite far into university before I really became a feminist or really started to learn about it at all. But the Penelopiad, or the Penelopiad, I don't know how to pronounce that, was probably one of the books that kick-started that. Now, remember I said when I was 16 I got started on my Jane Austen love? I managed to spread that out for a while because I knew there were only 6 books. I didn't want to have finished them all too soon. So it was when I was 21 that I finally read my 6th and final Jane Austen book. That was the first time I read Persuasion. And holy shit, I did well at saving the best to last because Persuasion is my favourite. It's a lot more jaded than her earlier ones. You can tell it's the last one that she wrote. It has a very different style. But then on the flip side, it is actually the most romantic. It's the one where I most get into the love story. They're all bloody brilliant, but that's the bloody brilliantest of all. When I was 22, that was the first time that I read The Princess Bride. Reading this was such a funny experience because I grew up with the movie The Princess Bride and it's one of my all-time favourite films, so I'd always been a little bit scared to read the book. Usually I get the other way around, I don't want to watch the film of one of my favourite books, but because I love the movie too much, I was scared that I'd be disappointed by the book. And because the book is quite a central part of the movie, I kind of felt like there was so much pressure because it was like, I love the book The Princess Bride, I know it so well from the movie, what if it isn't like that in real life? Now, the first line of The Princess Bride, as you'll know if you've read it, is, "This is my favourite book in all the world, though I have never read it." The second I opened up this book and saw that line, I knew I was going to be fine, because that put into words exactly how I was feeling. This was my favourite book in the world, even though I'd never read it. And now, having read it, I can tell you that I never thought such a thing was possible, but I love it even more than the movie. Now, when I was 23, this wasn't the first time I read this book, but the first time that I truly fell in love with this book, that was when I reread Harry Potter. The first time around reading these books, I'd fizzled off at around book 4, so it was when I was 23 that I finally made it the whole way through the series. And I really regret having missed all those years of being obsessed with Harry Potter. All of my friends were, and it must have been so much fun growing up with the books coming out and so exciting, but somehow I missed all of that. But I have now read the series through twice since then, and watched all the movies, and been to the Warner Brothers studio tour, so I'm doing my best to make up for lost time. When I was 24 was the first time that I read The Colour Purple, and this book is now one of my favourites. There are so many great things to say about this wonderful book, but for the purposes of this tag, just in terms of how it affected my future reading experience, one thing this book did was get me over my aversion to reading dialects. I've been kind of put off reading dialects since trying to read Wuthering Heights at school, but actually what I learned from reading this is that if you stick to just reading kind of standard English, you are basically just reading a lot of rich white people's stories. And there's so many fantastic stories out there that might not be written in the standard English that I learnt at school. So that's just one defining thing about this book, how it changed me from that point onwards. But there's so many things, I could talk about this book for hours. When I was 25, I first read We Should All Be Feminists by Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. My dad gave me this as a present. It was right after I got accepted to my women's studies course at Oxford. And he gave it to me for my 25th birthday. So this was, I think, the first thing I read when I was 25. Which brings me up to present day when I'm 26 years old. And I don't yet know what the most important book I read this year will be. There's already been so many books this year that I found really memorable, and I don't know which one I will look back on in the years to come as the single most important one. Reading The Power by Naomi Alderman, that I have a feeling is a book I'll remember for a long time. Also reading The Space Between Us by Threti Umrigar. Those are probably the two that I found the most powerful. But who knows, I'm excited to look back one day on all the books I read when I was 26 and see which ones have stuck with me. So I would love to see some of you guys do this tag or something a bit similar. Just go down memory lane and tell me about the first time you read some of the most important books to you. I'm going to tag a couple of people. I would love to see my Girl Sex 101 book club girls do this tag. So that's Joss from Scribbles Read and Emma Tobias. I would also love to see Emily do this one from Possibly Literate, but I really would just love to see anybody do this tag or their own variation of it. So don't forget to give this video a thumbs up if you liked it, and of course hit that subscribe button for new videos every Friday. See you next time!